today changes my whole entire life.
Welcome to Gritability, a podcast about the power of perseverance, overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds to attain the life of your dreams. I'm your podcast host, Adam Clausen, and today I am solo in the studio. Figured I would come in here and talk a little bit about the legal aspects of the system. Ro and I were recently watching the Depp versus Heard trial, and it was kind of surprising considering Ro's experience with the system through me, the legal system, and the number of things that I found myself explaining to her. And we talked about, you know what, there's probably a pretty good deal of interest because there's a number of notable cases kind of making their way through the courts right now. You know, we have presidential nominees who are fighting their own legal battles. So there's a lot to think about and consider when we talk about our legal system. So that's what we're going to focus on today, because for me, I had to do a lot of things that had never been done before to win my freedom to ultimately be here in the studio today. And many of those things had a legal significance. So for those of you who don't know, I was serving a 213-year prison sentence due to stacked mandatory minimum sentences. And thankfully, that law no longer exists in that form or fashion. Individuals can no longer be sentenced to those stacked sentences as a result of a change in the law. Thankfully, Congress went back, changed the law. The problem was they did not make it retroactive, meaning it does not apply to anyone who's already sentenced. It only applies from that point forward. And although to the average person, that obviously makes zero sense, right? Because if you're saying, man, this is unjust, we shouldn't be doing this anymore, why would you say all of those people that we already sentenced, oh, well, too bad, you're stuck? But that's how our legal system works. It's much more difficult to gain access to the courts, especially once you're already convicted, once you're in the system. And, you know, that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, kind of the process, what that looks like. And I figured we'd come at it from the very beginning because, unfortunately, I've been through that process a couple of times and it never really worked out well for me, but I was very fortunate on the back end to get some relief. Took me a long time to get it, over 20 years, 5 months, 17 days for anybody who's counting. Whew. But I still vividly recall those first couple of days, what it was like shortly after my arrest. And it all starts with the case, the legal premise here starts in the media because, and this is important to note, the way that our judicial system works is, you know, innocent until proven guilty, but how many things play out in the media? And prosecutors have a distinct advantage here, right? Because, you know, when they charge someone, they pick up the phone and they call, you know, their local media source, the crime reporter, and it's a prosecutor giving a press release, often, you know, written, saying, here's the individual, this is what they're suspected of, they've been indicted, and on and on. It's entirely their version of the events that is now going out to the public, right? So that's how it's initially framed. And believe me, that is never, ever favorable to the person who then has to defend themselves from whatever those accusations and charges are. And that's the unfortunate side of our system. And, you know, if we go back to the foundations, obviously, like, you know, when we came up with this judicial system, we didn't have the media as we have it today, where instantly, you know, you can put stuff out and everybody, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people have access to that. So if it's a big enough case, and that information goes out and the prosecutor says, well, we're charging this person with this. Although we want to maintain the presumption of innocence, people start to form opinions pretty quickly, right? Just being honest. I mean, we're all human, right? We all have bias, and we start planting those seeds, and prosecutors are looked at as authority figures, right? So they have certain authority in the media, and so does the media. Well, until recently, people question the media more nowadays. But back when I was initially arrested and, the reports went out in the papers, man, it was a done deal. Basically, they were, they had me convicted before I even made it to trial. So that's an important note right there. The way that part of the system works, from the time of your arrest, prosecutors are controlling the narrative, right? They're framing how those charges are going to be put out to the masses. And, people can say that they aren't affected by it, but they are. It's human nature. So the second part of that is, the legal misconceptions. Well, let me start with the actual indictment process, because, people are like, well, they were indicted, so there had to have been information. There had to have been something of substance. There's an old saying that says, you can indict a ham sandwich, which is simply to say, like, it takes so little to get an indictment against someone. It's such a low standard, such a low threshold. And honestly, anybody can come in there in front of the grand jury, and they can do it anonymously, and they can say that they heard, that they saw, whatever the case may be. It takes very, very little information to be presented to a grand jury. And a grand jury is what it sounds like. It's a group of individuals who have been impaneled specifically to hear this information and basically just to sign off and say, yep, there's enough here. Charges can move forward. And that's all it's meant to be, just like this high of a hurdle to get over. So honestly, it really doesn't mean anything when someone's been indicted. Very, very low threshold. Interesting side note on that. As we were preparing for trial, when I was getting ready to go to trial, I got all of my grand jury testimony, which I was excited to get that, because for me, I wanted to see everyone that they had paraded in front of the grand jury who had anything to say about me. And man, it was just demoralizing, to be honest, because there was all sorts of people that came in there and just talked about all sorts of things that weren't even related to the case. But, the prosecutor can do that. And interesting, unlike a jury trial, what you're going to see on TV, when a prosecutor brings a witness in front of the grand jury, they are allowed to lead them through testimony. For instance, prosecutor will say, Mr. Jones, on December 1st, 1998, isn't it true that you saw defendant Adam Clausen walk into the store at the corner of 7th and Market, and he proceeded to pull out a pistol and commenced to threaten the person who was standing right there? Like, literally, the prosecutor gets to walk that person through step by step through the process. And all the person up on the stand has to say is, yes, that's exactly what happened. They don't even have to really testify, right? Like, unlike when you go to trial, you are absolutely not allowed to lead a witness. In an actual jury trial, if a witness is going to be called, they have to get up on the stand and they actually have to speak for themselves. That's the key difference. In the grand jury, to get an indictment, they just say yes or no. It's literally that easy. That's why, an indictment honestly is not that big of a deal. So yeah, not to get hung up on that. We see people who are indicted and it's, flashed on the news. Don't give that too much weight. That doesn't mean a whole lot. Confidential informants. Here's a good one. CIs, right? So a lot of times this is what's used. It's what's used to get a search warrant, to go into someone's home, to take things either before a person's charged or maybe it's after a person's charged. If you charge a big group of people, I used to see this all the time in the big drug conspiracies in the city when we were in Philly, right? They'd get a group of, 20, 30 people that were all part of this neighborhood drug conspiracy where they were running blocks and, slinging dope out of there. And they'd bring them all in, get them indicted, and one by one, they'd start dropping off. We'd be going down to court and there'd be a couple less people each day. We were like, hey, what happened to so-and-so? And they're like, I don't know, man. But next thing you know, there's another statement from a confidential informant. And that's generally, it's that person who's given up information either on the case or there's people, believe it or not, confidential informants. There are people in the community who work with law enforcement who are actually paid to provide information to law enforcement. Like, it's like a job. Like, these people are looking to set people up and gain information, and they do so in exchange, not only for money, but, for leniency and other charges that they have. So a lot of information that gets used to kind of start investigations or to get those initial grand jury indictments to get things going. That's a lot of time where it starts. It's generally inside information. It's not like you would, or like we see on TV, especially old TV, where there's like detective work and, they're working really hard to like figure out, they have clues and they got to put the pieces together. Man, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. If you know anybody in law enforcement, you can ask them about that. And they'll tell you, like, there's more than enough people who are providing information. And it's basically just about distilling that information down to figure out what's the honest or closest to the truth of what actually happened. And then they figure it out from there and use that information. There's no real detective work that goes into that. That's just kind of the background on how we get the charges and get there. But ultimately, after you get that indictment, which is such a low threshold, then you start the process of, it's either plea negotiations or going to trial. You're going to get one or the other, right? And the vast majority, 98% of the cases, especially in the federal system, they have a 99% conviction rate in the federal judicial system, criminal system, and 98, I think, the vast majority of people plead out. They negotiate some sort of plea bargain. And that's because of that conviction rate. So that's where most cases, even from the very beginning, get on that path, which is very different. Now you're kind of negotiating for a range of sentence. You're basically saying, I'm not trying to go to trial, and whether or not you're fully guilty. Here's another reality of the system. Most people that get caught up in the system are already in circumstances where they leave themselves susceptible to criminal charges. What do I mean? Like, I might get caught up in a drug deal where it looks like maybe I had something to do with it, but I really wasn't profiting. Like, maybe I wasn't making any money off of that drug deal, but the guy that I was with, he was the one actually selling it. But it just looks like I'm a part of it. I'm going to have a real hard time, winning a case that says I didn't know anything. I didn't have anything to do with it. Like, it's going to be guilt by association. And although that person, like, if I was that person right there and I didn't actually benefit from that transaction, the likelihood is, like, I'm running in those circles. I'm generally doing dirt anyways, and I'm around all of it. So if I get pulled into some other case, I might not actually be guilty of that, but damn, I had put myself in a bad spot and I was guilty of all sorts of stuff otherwise. Now, just to be clear, for the purposes here, the 213 years that I got, I did all that, right? I did all those crimes. And I've acknowledged before that I was involved in all sorts of other things as far as drugs and drug sales. And believe me, I'm not proud of any of that. I'm saying that, man, I was culpable. I put myself repeatedly in bad spots. Like if I would have ended up in a drug case, and wound up with a crazy sentence for that, I wouldn't have been able to fight that either. So it's really about just when you're in those sorts of circumstances and surrounded by all sorts of criminal activity, it's very difficult to prove innocence, even if you didn't actually do it. So that's a little bit of background there, right? And coming into the court system, you get indicted, and now if you're, bold enough, some would say crazy enough, to take on the system and decide, you know what, I'm going to take it to trial. I'm going to say I didn't even do it. Knowing that they have a 98%, 99 conviction rate, you know what you're up against. You know that it's such a long shot to win. But you see it on TV, right? You see people who go to trial and they get a jury and occasionally they win. So you see that and you think to yourself, maybe I could be that one. I could be that 1%. Maybe I could beat them. And little known fact is that in my jury trial, we did have some wins. They were small wins, and they weren't attributed to me. My co-defendant was acquitted of 6 of the 9 counts against him. And we'll get to that in a second. Like, how does that happen? But before we get too far ahead, I decided to go to trial. So I thought, I'll take my shot. I'll be that 1%. And really what contributed to my decision was one, I decided that I was not going to cooperate. And in my case, that was really the only offer that was on the table. It was, hey, you want to plea? You want to get less time? You got to cooperate with us. When I said, that's not an option for me, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to put someone else in here with a life sentence. The decision was, okay, we're going to trial. So having to gear up for it, I had to learn the process. I didn't really know what that process looked like. So as we went through it step by step, I was learning, trying to absorb as much as possible. And, lawyers on TV make it look really, really easy. But if you've never picked up a law book, it's called legalese. Legalese is the language of the law. And believe me, it's like learning a foreign language. Not an easy one, not Spanish, more like learning Russian, something that's completely foreign to you. And you got to figure it out. And this is on a timeline, so you're doing it on the fly. I was doing it on the fly. And I only had to know this much of the law, right? Like I had 2 charges. I had robbery charges, Hobbs Act robbery, 1941, which is part of the, along with like RICO and racketeering, all of the racketeering statutes. There's a robbery statute that falls in there. It's robbery that affects interstate commerce. Not to get too technical, I had to learn all about that. The second part was, since I used a firearm, there was an additional statute, the 924C firearm statute. That's what I had to know. I had to know the robbery statute and the firearm statute. Seems simple enough, right? But then you get into all the procedural mechanics of understanding what happens at each phase, what information you're eligible to receive if you file the motions asking the court for it at just the right time. And all of a sudden you're like, damn, this is complicated. That's why attorneys get so much money. Right? That's why they bill so much per hour. It's complicated. There's a lot there. So even though I only had this narrow window, I quickly realized, wow, this was a lot to take on. And I'm find myself, in the law library, limited amount of time that I, as an incarcerated person, am given to actually get in the law books or get on the legal computer and do some research and, man, try and figure it out for myself. But I knew that if I was going to have even half a chance, I had to do my part. I had to figure out the law as much as possible and be able to have an intelligent conversation with my attorney, because I know that, he didn't necessarily have the same level of interest in preserving my life as I did. So, I had to get fully invested. And my co-defendants, for their part, because there were two other guys who went to trial with me, they were right there assisting. We were all trying to learn it as we went. But damn, that was tough. So learning about the laws and then, starting to piece together a defense. So what's our defense going to be? And coming up with something that makes sense, right? Because you got to present this to a jury. And again, in my mind, I'm thinking about what I've seen on TV. I was like, hey, we make a good case to the jury, and the jury, if they believe it, regardless of what the truth is, regardless of the fact that I actually did all these things, I'm going to get up there and try and convince them that I did not, that the guys who are testifying against us are just stone cold liars, which they were. They were that too. They just happen to be telling the truth on this part. And all of these other people coming in, which, believe me, there was a lengthy witness list of people who were ready to come in and testify. So to try and formulate a defense, whatever that looks like, we spent some time putting together documents and all the different people that had come in and going through all this paperwork and trying to figure out how we were going to utilize it. So we put together what we thought was a defense. Part of it was technical on the terms of the crime, but it was really to say, listen, we weren't there, we weren't a part of this, and you have no credible witnesses. We attacked everybody else's credibility. And to be fair, everybody involved in our case, they were in those circles. They were involved in some sort of illegal activity. So, the credibility issue we thought was reasonable. And when we started picking our jury, right, just like you'd see on TV, where this is supposed to be a jury of your peers. So what does that mean exactly? What's a jury of your peers? If you're the average person who ends up in court, especially criminal court, these are not people from your neighborhood, right? These are not people that you grew up with. These are people from the suburbs who are generally a little bit more affluent. They are, at a different place in life. Like, crime is foreign to them. And they've watched, crime shows on TV as well and believe things should go a certain way. And I'll tell you what came out in our voir dire, which is your questioning of all these jurors, was damn. There's a lot of people that work for the government, work for state agencies, who are all somehow like connected to government, to law enforcement. And it seemed like it was going to be an uphill battle for us to find anyone who might be sympathetic to us being involved in criminal activity. So that was a wake-up call. Like, when we went through picking our jury, I can't say by the time we were done that I felt really good, that I thought anybody who was on that panel was really going to give us a shot. So I was a little bit concerned from the start right there. But then I said, you know what? We're going to give this a go, man. Like, we've got a defense. At this point, we're all in anyways. Like, let's go. But then we needed to really start working with our defense attorneys, figuring out, okay, how are we presenting this? Because I don't know, I wanted them to perform like you see on TV, right? Like, you're my attorney. You're going to get up there. You're going to question these all of these witnesses. You're going to put on a good show. You're going to play to the jury, and you're going to be charismatic. And they're not generally like that. Some of them are. Mine wasn't, right? Thankfully, we did have one. We had one who, for his part, Chuck he's Mr. TV. And until he had a personal situation that arose a couple years ago, girl ended up dead in his bathtub. I think he was on his way to becoming a senator. Like, he was that good. He was Mr. Prime Time. But he wasn't my attorney. He was my co-defendant who did get acquitted of 6 of the 9 counts. So not having that, and although that was in my mind, not having that kind of dynamic attorney, somebody advocating for you, makes it very difficult to persuade the jury. And I'm going to be honest, it's not like the prosecutor in my case was super persuasive and suave and none of that. He was just fact driven. But he did have the truth on his side. So that was working against me as well. So when you get in there, when you're actually in the courtroom and you have a jury and it's that adversarial process, most of the time, we see the highlights now on TV, like that Depp versus Heard. We're going to see the highlights from periods in that courtroom. But the majority of the time, it's not all flash. It's not all that flamboyant. There aren't those gotcha moments where you catch somebody, in the middle of a lie. Those are the highlight reels. The rest of the time, man, is pretty boring, is pretty drawn out. You're watching jurors fall asleep, and I'm like, damn, I'm fighting for my life over here. My life is literally on the line, and this person's falling asleep. Like, are they paying attention? So that's what you got to deal with the attorneys, the defense attorneys, with the jurors, and then with the defense attorneys, not living up to my expectations. And here's another part of that legal process. What people don't realize is attorneys do not simply have to do what you say. You're the client. They are the legal expert and the professional representing you. So if you're asking them to do something that is unethical, illegal, or they just simply do not agree with from their professional perspective, they don't have to do it. They don't have to do it. They just say, sorry, I'm not doing that. And then they get up there and they go do something else. And the whole time you're sitting there like, oh my God, how come you're not doing this? Like, this is what we talked about. This is what I expected you to do. You're blowing it. I'm watching my life go down the drain and I'm like, I can't do anything about it. Like, what do? I stand up, I act out. And I remember times during my trial where I considered that, like, do I just jump up and try and take control of this myself? But I knew I didn't have that ability. Like, that wasn't realistic. So I was left at the mercy of my attorney, who ultimately made a strategic decision in closing to acknowledge that I was there, that I was present, that I was a part of this. And he tried to spin it on a legal technicality, which ultimately basically was just a concession of guilt. And the unfortunate reality is he was able to get up there and do it. I had no recourse. There was nothing I could say in response to it. And at that point, it's too late. Like, you planted the seeds with the jury. So I'm like, man, I'm screwed at this point. So that was a tough thing to figure out. How do you move past? And at that point, it's really done, right? My attorney I felt like he sold me out. I've never agreed with that. I fought that on appeals for years, but the courts all reaffirmed on each of those appeals that was his strategic trial decision and he had the right to make it, and I forfeited that. So that's a harsh reality. So it's not like you see it on TV. You don't get to tell your attorney what to do. You're not always driving, unless, of course, you're paying $1 million on retainer, like maybe Johnny Depp is, right? Unless you have that ability, for the normal person, the criminal justice system is heavily weighted against you. And I noticed there was, to kind of back up to this, before, he actually pled me out. Part of that court process is for you to be able to go in there and present yourself in a certain way, right? Like the jury is supposed to think that you're innocent until proven guilty. And if you're incarcerated, as the vast majority of people are, while they're awaiting to go to trial, and that's a whole separate issue. We can get into our bail system and how that's set up. But bail for most people, especially if it's a serious crime, I had a string of robberies, I had prior convictions, I was on parole at the time, that's no bail. So for a lot of people, bail is not an option. So you're not going to get a chance to get out the door. You're going to have to fight your case from in prison. And here's a key point. If you're going to go to trial, what is that going to look like? You're coming from your cell block to come down to court each day. So what does your day look like? They wake you up at like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. They drag you down to the holding cells where they cuff and shackle you and then bring you through a tunnel. In this case, when I was in Philly, that tunnel takes you like 2.5 blocks from the holding center to the courthouse. It's underground. It's a special tunnel that they built. And there is a line of you walking single file next to the wall with U.S. Marshals guarding you like you're going to go somewhere. You're in a tunnel underground. There's no doors. There's no nothing. It goes to one place. It goes to the courthouse. You get to the other end, there's an elevator that takes you up, right? You go from one cell to another. There is no place to go. And the whole time you are handcuffed, shackled with a belly chain, right? And a black box if you're high security. So you can't move. You're shuffling 2 blocks underground. That's how your day starts. What a great way to start the day, right? Nothing to inspire a little confidence and feeling good before you get up there into court and you get to present yourself to the jury. Now, when you get upstairs, if you're lucky, you have access to clothes, to street clothes, right? Because you cannot be presented to the jury in prison garb, which at that time is either bright orange or at that time we had green, like green jumpsuits. They're not going to bring you into court in that, not in front of the jury. So they're either going to give you clothes, and you can imagine what those clothes probably look like. Salvation Army, something that they picked up at the thrift shop, figure it out, make it work. Or, like us, very fortunate to have people who are able to drop off clothes. It's not like they could, come every day with, fresh from the dry cleaners. Here's your suit. Go ahead, take your time, get dressed. You can shower, you can get ready. No, none of that, right? 3 a.m., you better have washed your face, fixed your hair, taken your single blade Bic razor and scraped whatever you could off your face so that you could look presentable by the time you got over there to get your clothes that were bundled up in probably a garbage bag or a shopping bag that they bring to you. And very unceremoniously, hurry up, get dressed. And we were allowed, over a week-long trial, 2 sets of clothes. So I don't know who shows up to court every day in the same thing, right? Like, these are my street clothes. Conceivably, this is how the jury is supposed to view me differently than being incarcerated. But I'm showing up in the same clothes most of those days. And day by day, it's getting more wrinkled. Clothes are probably a little funky. So trying to play this off to the jury like I'm not really in prison, I don't know if anybody was actually buying that. But that's the whole premise, right? And so even though we could have had additional clothes, it was set up so that we could not receive those, right? Again, it's one more thing that's kind of weighted against you. And again, it's by design. It's by design. So those were the clothes that we were wearing coming in. And I should also note that as I was doing that shuffle across for that 2.5 blocks underground, while I'm shackled, I am carrying a mesh laundry bag that is filled with manila envelopes and other documents pertaining to that day's witnesses. Because remember, like I was doing the prep work in advance of trial, feeling like I need to contribute to my own defense. My life's on the line. And so I know that these witnesses are going to be there today. Here's all my notes. Here's all my stuff. Um, let's just say it didn't look like a briefcase coming into court. It didn't look all professional. Um, but, these were the documents and these are the things that I'm bringing to my attorney who's, supposed to be using them on my defense. That didn't really work out too well either. So those notes were meant to counter many of these witnesses that were getting up on the stand. And I mentioned confidential informants, right? Like many of these witnesses were people who, were involved in other illegal activity. So they had a lot to benefit or potentially gain. But what happens is when an individual enters into an agreement with the government and says, yeah, I'm willing to give up information in exchange for leniency, the government very carefully crafts that agreement to say, well, they haven't really been promised anything, not yet. And you can ask them on cross-examination, well, isn't it your belief that you are going to receive some sort of benefit for your testimony today? And they say, well, I hope that I get some sort of benefit, but nothing's guaranteed. And that, again, is all very strategic and by design. But the reality is that person who's up there testifying has already been promised a reduction of, say, X amount of years in exchange for this. It just hasn't been given in writing, and there's no way to prove this. So when the jury hears about it, they're like, maybe they'll get something, maybe they won't, when it's already by design. And then add to the fact that you get an agent or a person from law enforcement who's seen as a credible person, as an authority figure. We look at people in uniform and we immediately, and there's a ton of science behind this. If somebody's in uniform, like we give them a different level of credibility. Oh, they got a uniform on. They must know what they're talking about. We get a person who's got a credential, got a uniform up there and says, oh, yeah. That person should be seen as a credible source. Like he's a credible witness. They start vouching for people that honestly, like they shouldn't be able to vouch for. You can't vouch for, a person's credibility. They're technically not supposed to be able to do that. But that's what happens. And, I'm telling you all of this. I'm sharing all of this information because this was my experience going through the court, right? I, just like you, who had probably never gone through the process, never gone through the courts, remember watching on TV. I watched like the O.J. Simpson trial. There were things like that where I said, man, like this is how the system works, right? And that wasn't my experience. It was very, very different. And by the time it was done, by the time that the jury came back, because they went out for deliberation, and it was a few hours, and so we were hopeful. But then when they came back and they called us in and said that they had reached a verdict, I'm like, well, that, in the whole scheme of things, that was pretty quick. I was exhausted. I was totally beat up, worn down, and this was only a week. It was a week-long trial. And when they came back, and I was the one that went first, they read my verdict first. By the time they, got to reading the first one, guilty, guilty, guilty. Man, after, a few times hearing that, because there was 27 counts. I had a 27 count indictment. I was found guilty on every single count. By the time it was done, I already knew that I had a life sentence because of the mandatory minimums, and I was numb. I was numb at that point. I was just exhausted. And I was like, man, this is not how I envisioned this. This is not what it looked like on TV. But I was just beat up, worn out. And then my co-defendant went. And they said, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I am so relieved. I'm so happy for him. And I'm like, wait a minute. How in the hell? Same witnesses, same charges, but the jury found him not guilty. I'm like, how does that happen? And they did that 6 times. He had 9 counts. And then they get to the 7th count and they say guilty. 8th count, guilty. 9th count, guilty. So they found him, convicted him of 1 robbery, 1 instance. And I was a little confused, but I'm like, well, okay, mandatory minimums. He's not getting a life sentence. That's great news. But I really couldn't reconcile, like, how does that work? How did the jury find him not guilty on those charges, despite the evidence, same charges? And I had all these questions. Our other co-defendant went, the third co-defendant, and he, like me, was found guilty on all counts. So I'm like, man, I don't get it. I don't get how we arrive at this point. But we went back. They took us out of the courtroom, put us back in the holding cells, and all 3 of us were in shock. We're in shock. And, I want to ask him, like, man, how did this happen? But all I could say was, man, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that you were acquitted of those 6, that you don't have a life sentence. It's going to be okay, man. Like, that was the one thing to hold on to. Like, okay, we got a win here. It was a small win, and it didn't apply to me, but thank God he chose to go to trial with us. Thank God he didn't end up with a life sentence. And then I started laughing, and that's when everybody got worried. They're looking at me like, what the hell is wrong with you? I know I've got a life sentence. And I started laughing because all I could think about was, man, this miserable dude that I had been with in the state prison, who every day, like, whenever somebody saw him, they'd be like, oh God, here he comes again. And I started laughing because I made a conscious decision. I said, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be him. Man, I'm going to hold on to hope. I'm going to try my hand at the appeals process. There's going to be light at the end of this tunnel. Man, and I chose to view things in that light and to stay positive and to believe that, I'd get another chance. Despite the fact that I knew what the appellate system looked like, that the odds were even longer than the trial system. Losing at trial was the first part. Trying to get back on appeal was even harder. So I walked out of that. It was an eye-opening experience. Not at all what I thought it was going to be. And I left with a lot of questions. I'll jump ahead and say this, that a couple years later, that attorney, that Showtime attorney, the guy who was able to dazzle the jury and win 6 of those 9 counts to get my co-defendant off of those counts, he had an opportunity to speak to 2 of our jurors. 2 of those jurors, and, they brought it up. They're like, oh, hey, yeah, we were part of that case, and oh my God, yeah, tragic. They're like, man, we had no idea. We had no idea about the time that those guys were facing. If we would have known, we would not have convicted them. What? They said, listen, there were so many people of questionable character, we questioned testimony. We wouldn't have convicted them all on all of those counts. They said, and the reason we as a jury chose not to convict your client on those 6 counts was just because he looked so young, so innocent. We just didn't think that he could or should be attached to this, despite the fact that all the same people gave the exact same testimony, putting him at all of those places. So that was the contradiction that was there. And I was left with that information like, what the hell do I do with that? The jury feels bad that I got a life sentence, but I can't use that information. There's no recourse there. And the fact is, regardless of how they felt that they would have done things differently, they couldn't. What's done is done. There's no way to revisit that. So I had to go through the appeals process. That process didn't take all that long. It took 5 years. Well, it took about 4 years because it was 2005, 4.5. 2005, by the time my appeals, and I argued all those things that I said, that my attorney was ineffective, that he did not do enough, that he basically pled me guilty by conceding that I was actually at these places. I had all these great legal arguments that questioned, the agents vouching for the credibility of witnesses, questionable eyewitness identification, different statements that were admitted into court, witnesses who should not have been permitted to testify. And I cited all this law, and I did it in what I felt like was a pretty eloquent manner. And again, I only had to focus on this much, just as the law that had applied to me. And I thought that I had learned enough and that I had solid legal grounds, and I put it all in front of the court. And repeatedly, at each stage of that process, I was denied. And I was often denied without explanation. And it was that final denial, 2005, sitting in my prison cell alone by myself with an envelope that I opened up, single sheet of paper in there. I opened it up, and all I recall was in bold, one word, denied. Denied. That's it. So 2005, my appeals were over. No chance for me to ever get back into court, not by conventional means. And it would take another 15 years. It would take Congress changing the law that put me there. It would take a relentless attorney advocacy from Roe, my wife, my family, from all these other supporters to basically bulldog our way back into the court and to get a judge to sign off on granting me compassionate release, which let me out of a crack that big. Like I just slid out that 1%. I was 1% of the 1% because I went to trial. I lost the appeals, no chance of recourse, and yet still found a crack of daylight to slide out through. And that's the only way that I'm here today. And I am definitely the exception. That is not how our legal system works. We see it, more and more frequently where individuals can prove that they are actually innocent, that they did not commit the crimes. And despite that fact, they can't get out of prison. They can't get off of death row. They can't get out of a life sentence. They can't get back into court because there's no mechanism to do that, even though we acknowledge that they are innocent. And it ends up taking many years, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. That's the unfortunate reality of our legal system, man. That's how it works. I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity, that I had that exception. But when I got out, it's not like, everything, all doors just open wide, and it was an easier process. I still had to go through the second part of our legal system, which is parole, probation, supervision. And that is a whole different legal battle. And it was one that honestly, I was not prepared to fight. I didn't want to fight. At that point, I was just happy to be free, willing to live within, the confines of that supervision for the limited term that I had. Thank God I only had 3 years. I have friends who have lifetime supervision, and that's a whole different ball game. That's a whole different battle that they are fighting. But thank God I only had 3 years. And thank God I was able to finish that up. But, there was legal consequences. to that as well, that basically governed how I lived for a number of years. But that's a story for another time. So I was fortunate to make it out of the legal system in one piece. My message is this. Don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to find yourself in court, in the media, facing those charges in the first place. But if it does happen, get yourself the best defense attorney you can afford. Those people are professionals. They understand the system far better than you can by yourself. And whatever you think you saw on TV is made for TV, right? That's not how it generally works in the real world. And I wouldn't want to see you get wrapped up in the system and end up, paying the ultimate price. But yeah, that was my experience with the system. Hopefully that gave you a little bit more insight on how it all works, how it's all rigged against defendants. Man, it's tough when you're on the other end of it. I hope you never find yourself on the end of it. But if you do, be prepared to fight. Be prepared to face a whole lot of adversity and persevere. And that's what Gritability is all about. That's the reason I'm still here today. We don't give up hope. We keep fighting. We battle through. We find a way to win no matter what. Man, the power of perseverance. Overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds to attain the life of your dreams. That's the reason I'm here. That's the reason we have Gritability. It's been another amazing episode. I love spending time with you guys. Hopefully you found some value in this. And we'll see you back here on the next episode.